So, under Tennessee law, marital property are assets and debts that are accumulated during the marriage. Things that are not included in the marital estate may be property that you had before the marriage that has stayed your separate property, or any property that a spouse received during the marriage by way of gift or inheritance that they have kept as their separate property. So, for example, I always tell people, if say your grandmother passes away and she leaves you $100,000, you put it in a separate account. You don't commingle any marital funds in that account, which co-marital funds would include wages, but you keep it in a separate account in your name only, then that retains its separate identity. Property owned before the marriage in the state of Tennessee a lot of times will still be what we call separate property. It could be, though, that property may have been what we call transmuted during the marriage into marital property. That gets into a lot of technicalities, but if you had something that you own before the marriage and you've kept it in your separate name, and the other spouse has maybe not contributed to the appreciation of that asset, most of the time it's going to be remaining as separate property. So over time, there are ways that separate property can become marital property. It's by what we call transmutation. And that can be, for example, if you had a separate bank account before you got married, and at some point you titled that bank account in both parties' names, there may be transmutation there from a separate asset to a marital asset. Other times where we see this often happen is with a piece of real estate. Someone may have owned it before the marriage, they got married, and then they put the deed in their name and also the spouse's name, and the spouse then contributes to the upkeep of that property, or helps pay the mortgage, or the parties live in that residence and they consider that to be their marital residence. So there's different ways that separate property can become marital property. So commingling can affect asset allocation in the state of Tennessee. The first thing the court's going to do, though, is determine whether the property is separate property or marital property. Then the court's going to make a division of that marital property. So once an asset has been commingled, you can try to reverse it to the nature that it was before, but you might run into issues if the property, for example, is already titled in your spouse's name. More than likely, the spouse is not going to title it back to the other spouse's name that it was originally in. But a lot of times what we're looking at doing is seeing if we can identify the portion of that asset that was separate property and convince a court that that spouse should receive that portion of that asset as their separate property.